In the sun-baked streets of Redemption Creek, a young sheriff adjusts his tin star in the harsh morning light. His fingers move with a precision that seems almost surgical, making the weathered outlaws at Morgan's Tavern exchange mocking glances. They snicker at his clean-cut appearance, his seemingly hesitant demeanor, completely unaware that those same methodical hands can draw and fire with such supernatural speed that even the most hardened gunmen have never witnessed its equal. They're about to discover that true authority isn't measured in scars or reputation, but in the unwavering resolve of a man who's made peace with death long before they ever will. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The relentless Arizona sun beat down on Redemption Creek, casting harsh shadows across the town's weather-beaten buildings. What had once been a simple mining outpost had transformed over 5 short years into a sprawling settlement that straddled the divide between civilization and the untamed frontier. The discovery of copper in the nearby hills had brought a flood of prospectors, merchants, and the inevitable wave of those looking to profit from others' fortunes without dirtying their hands in honest work. Sheriff Ethan Caldwell, 26, years old but looking barely out of his teens, walked his morning patrol with measured steps. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust from the parched earth as he moved with unhurried purpose down the town's main thoroughfare. The badge on his simple blue vest caught the sunlight, the gleaming metal standing in stark contrast to his unassuming presence. To most folk in Redemption Creek, Ethan was a curiosity, the son of a bookkeeper who'd somehow been granted authority over a town increasingly populated by men who lived by different rules than those written in law books. He carried no swagger, displayed no threatening glares, just quiet observation and careful attention. The older residents appreciated his prompt response to disturbances and his fair-minded approach to settling disputes, but the rougher elements that gathered at Morgan's Tavern viewed his youth and composed manner as signs of weakness. "Morning, Sheriff," called Samuel Wright from the doorway of his general store, his voice carrying a genuine warmth. The elderly shopkeeper had been among the first to settle in Redemption Creek, back when it was nothing more than 3 buildings and an abundance of hope. "Morning, Mr. Wright," Ethan replied, tipping his hat. "Any new supplies coming in with today's stage?" "Should be, assuming those road repairs near Apache Pass are holding up. Could use your help unloading if you've got time later." Ethan nodded, his blue eyes continuing their careful scan of the street, even as he maintained the conversation. "I'll stop by after the stage arrives." From the shadows of Morgan's Tavern porch, Luther Holt and his companions watched the exchange with thinly veiled contempt. Holt, a man whose face bore the scars of countless bar fights and whose reputation had been built on a foundation of intimidation, took a long draw from his cigarette before flicking it into the street. "Would you look at that?" he muttered to Silas Decker, a newly arrived hired gun whose reputation had preceded him from Texas. Our law enforcer, acting like he's reading inventory while having a friendly chat. Decker studied the young sheriff with professional interest. "Heard things," he remarked, his voice pitched low enough that only Holt could hear, "from up Colorado way, about a lawman matching his description. They say a lot of things," Holt interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. "But I've been watching him 2 weeks now. He's got book learning, sure. Writes his reports all neat and proper, helps old ladies cross the street. But first sign of real trouble, he'll fold faster than a bad hand at poker." Inside the tavern, Morgan himself, a former boxer whose broken nose and cauliflower ears marked his previous profession, polished glasses while keeping half an ear on the conversation outside. Unlike Holt, he'd been in Redemption Creek long enough to witness certain incidents, like the time 3 months back when the Watterson brothers had decided that local ordinances didn't apply to them. Morgan still couldn't fully explain what he'd seen that day, just that one moment the Wattersons were drawing their guns, and the next they were disarmed and on the ground, looking as confused as everyone else who'd witnessed it. Dr. Eleanor. Reed observed the sheriff from the shaded porch of her clinic across the street. As the town's only physician, she'd patched up enough gunshot victims to know the difference between men who sought violence and those who understood its cost. Eleanor was one of the few who recognized what others missed in Ethan's careful movements. The economy of motion, the constant awareness, the way his hands never strayed far from his holsters despite his relaxed demeanor. Halfway down the street, Deputy Miles Rodriguez hurried toward the sheriff, his young face flushed with excitement or concern, possibly both. Miles had been appointed deputy just 6 months prior, fresh-faced and eager, but showing a natural aptitude for the work that had impressed Ethan enough to take him on, despite his youth. "Sheriff," Miles called, slightly out of breath as he approached. "Just got word from Jefferson at the telegraph office. Judge Harrison's train will arrive tomorrow morning, bringing the Cassidy brothers for trial." The deputy lowered his voice, glancing nervously at the growing number of unfamiliar faces gathering around Morgan's tavern. "Folks are getting anxious. Rumor is that Virgil Ward and his gang have been spotted 2 days' ride from here, burning through every settlement between here and Salt River Junction." Ethan nodded, his blue eyes never ceasing their methodical assessment of the street and its occupants. The Cassidy brothers had been part of Ward's operation before Ethan intercepted them during an attempted stagecoach robbery outside of town. Their capture had been clean, professional, 3 shots that had disabled both men without serious injury, but the speed of those shots, the impossible precision, had started whispers among those who'd witnessed it. "Might be nothing," Miles continued, though his expression suggested he didn't believe that. "But there's been a lot of new faces in town since yesterday's stage arrived." "I've noticed," Ethan replied quietly. From his usual spot in the shade of the livery stable, retired Marshal Jacob Forrest observed the exchange with interest. The elderly former lawman's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes, still sharp despite his 70 years, missed nothing. "Hood there, Sheriff," Forrest called out, his voice stronger than his aged appearance might suggest. "Fine day for keeping skills sharp, wouldn't you say?" The old marshal's eyes held a hidden meaning that few would understand. Even fewer knew that Forrest had been the one to recognize something in Ethan 5 years ago, something that reminded him of his own legendary career before age, and a bullet in his hip had forced his retirement. Viewer still knew about the dawn practice sessions in the abandoned silver mine outside of town, where Forrest had helped Ethan develop a natural talent into something extraordinary. Inside Morgan's tavern, Holt had moved to a table near the window, nursing a whiskey despite the early hour. 3 more men had joined him, rough-looking characters whose eyes constantly scanned the room and whose hands never strayed far from their weapons. "Look at him out there," Holt sneered, gesturing with his glass toward the sheriff. "Playing. Lawman like it's some kind of game." He leaned in closer to Decker. "You know what I heard? That he's never even killed a man. Got his tin star because the town council thought having a civilized face of the law would attract more respectable business." Decker frowned slightly. "The Cassidy brothers aren't exactly easy takings. I crossed paths with them in El Paso last year. Mean as rattlers, both of them." "Lucky shots," Holt dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Or they were drunk, or the sun was in their eyes. Take your pick." From his position behind the bar, Morgan watched the gathering of hard men with growing unease. He'd seen enough trouble in his time to recognize the signs, the positioned men, the quiet conversations, the strategic placement of newcomers throughout his establishment and the town beyond. "Tomorrow, when Ward rides in to free the Cassidy, boys," Holt continued, his voice pitched just loud enough for his companions to hear, "we'll see what our bookkeeper's son is really made of. Ward doesn't play gentle, and neither do I. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Outside, Ethan could feel the tension building in his town, like pressure before a thunderstorm. He saw it in the way mothers hurried their children along the boardwalks, heard it in the nervous chatter at Madeline Parker's schoolhouse, sensed it in the way regular customers were avoiding Morgan's tavern, despite the punishing heat that typically drove men to seek refreshment. He maintained his usual measured pace, his hands hanging loose at his sides, never touching the carefully maintained Colt revolvers that rode his hips. Those guns, like their owner, didn't look special. No fancy engravings, no ivory handles, just well-oiled tools that had never once failed him. As the morning progressed, more unfamiliar riders filtered into Redemption Creek. Some were honest, travelers drawn by news of the copper boom or just passing through on their way to somewhere else. Others carried darker intentions, their eyes following the young sheriff's movements, measuring him, looking for vulnerabilities. They found only that same deliberate efficiency, those same precise movements that made him seem so ineffectual. None of them noticed how his eyes registered every detail, the way Holt's right hand never strayed far from his gun, how Decker's watchful gaze marked him as more dangerous than his companions, the subtle gathering of hard-eyed men around the tavern's perimeter. Ethan saw it all, catalogued every potential threat while maintaining that same composed demeanor that led everyone to underestimate him. Maria Sanchez, who ran the town's only proper restaurant beside her husband's blacksmith shop, crossed herself as Ethan passed by her establishment for the second time that morning. "Be careful, Sheriff," she said quietly in her melodious accent. "There are wolves circling our town today." Ethan paused, offering her a small smile that didn't quite reach. His eyes, "Don't worry, Mrs. Sanchez. I'll make sure they don't trouble anyone." "It is not us I worry for," she replied, her dark eyes knowing. "Some men, they cannot see the hawk until its talons are upon them." As noon approached and the heat intensified, the tension in Redemption Creek grew palpable. Ethan sat at his desk in the jailhouse, methodically cleaning his Colts, while Deputy Miles kept watch by the window. In their cells, the Cassidy brothers observed the sheriff's movements with growing unease. "You don't know what's coming, lawman," Frank Cassidy spat from behind the iron bars. "Ward ain't like other outlaws. He enjoys making examples." His brother William nodded silently, his eyes fixed on Ethan's hands as they worked the cleaning cloth over each part of the disassembled revolver. There was something hypnotic about the sheriff's movements, so precise, so assured, without a single wasted motion. "Tell me about him then," Ethan said softly, not looking up from his task. "About the man whose name you invoke like he's something more than just another outlaw. What makes Virgil Ward different from the others I've faced?" The question seemed to catch Frank off guard. He exchanged a glance with his brother before answering. "Different? Ward doesn't just rob and run. He doesn't leave witnesses who might talk later." Frank's voice dropped lower, taking on an almost reverent quality. "He makes sure everyone sees, makes sure they remember what happens to folks who stand against him. There was this settlement outside of Tucson," William added, breaking his usual silence. "All they did was refuse to pay when Ward demanded protection money. Ward spent hours showing those people what defiance costs." His voice trailed off, his face paling at the memory. Outside, Jacob Forrest made his way toward the jailhouse, his cane tapping a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. He'd counted 14 unfamiliar faces in the last hour alone, none of them looking like honest travelers or prospectors. Their weapons were too new, their clothes too fine, despite the trail dust they'd artfully applied to appear as ordinary. "Drifters. Ethan," the old marshal called as he entered the jailhouse. "Situation brewing. Holt's gathering quite a crowd at Morgan's place. Some faces I recognize from wanted posters, others I've never seen before but don't like the look of." He lowered himself carefully into a chair, his arthritic hip protesting the movement. They're trying to be subtle about it, but they're positioning themselves around town like cavalry preparing for an attack. Miles's hand moved instinctively to his gun. Should we wire for help from Fort Mackenzie? Captain Reynolds owes us after that business with the deserters. Could have 20 soldiers here by sundown tomorrow. No time, Ethan replied, sliding the reassembled Colts back into their holsters with smooth precision. Judge Harrison's train leaves Santa Fe at dawn. By the time help arrived, it would already be too late. He stood, stretching like a cat waking from a nap. Besides, sometimes having too many guns just means more chances for things to go wrong. More men to get caught in the crossfire. Eleanor Reed pushed through the door, her medical bag clutched tightly in one hand. The doctor's usually impeccable appearance was slightly disheveled, her dark hair coming loose from its pins as if she'd rushed across town. "Ethan, they just brought news from Silver Cliff," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Ward's gang hit the settlement yesterday. 4 dead, and the marshal—" She paused, struggling to maintain her professional composure. "They say he took 2 bullets trying to evacuate the general store. He'll live, but his deputy wasn't so fortunate. In their cells, the Cassidy brothers exchanged knowing looks. 'Told you,' Frank muttered. 'Ward's sending a message. The next town's going to be worse. Always is.'" Ethan walked to the window, watching. As lanterns began to illuminate the gathering dusk, the afternoon stage had brought even more passengers than usual, most heading straight for Morgan's Tavern. Through the deepening shadows, he could see Luther Holt on the tavern's porch, his scarred face animated as he addressed a growing circle of attentive listeners. "Eleanor," Ethan said quietly, "you might want to prepare your clinic. Tomorrow will be busy. One way or another." He turned to Miles. "Get word to Mrs. Parker at the schoolhouse. Any families that want to leave town tonight, help them pack. The rest should stay indoors tomorrow until this is settled." "And how exactly do you plan to settle it?" Forrest asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. The old lawman's eyes held a mixture of concern and pride as he watched the young sheriff he'd mentored. Ethan's hands moved in that precise way that made people underestimate him, checking his gun belt one final time. "The same way you taught me, Jacob," he replied, his voice calm and measured. "Quick, clean, and with as little bloodshed as possible. Every shot has to count. Every move has to matter." "They won't make it easy," Forrest warned. "Ward's men don't. Fight fair. Never have, never will." A small smile touched Ethan's lips. "That's why we're going to change the rules on them." He turned to Miles. "Remember those drills we practiced? The ones Jacob showed us?" The young deputy nodded eagerly, standing a little straighter. "Good," Ethan continued. "Tonight we prepare. Tomorrow we show them what justice really looks like in Redemption Creek." As darkness settled over the town, Ethan began his preparations. Walking the streets one last time, noting every vantage point, every possible angle of attack. Morgan caught his eye as he passed the tavern, giving him a subtle nod from behind the bar. The tavern keeper would keep track of the strangers, marking the dangerous ones for later. In their cells, the Cassidy brothers watched the young sheriffs. Quiet confidence with growing uncertainty. They'd seen Ward's brand of strength before, the kind that destroyed everything it touched, that left towns in ruins and good men in graves. But this was different. This was the kind of strength that didn't need to announce itself, the kind that came with a speed so extraordinary it seemed impossible, the kind their boss might not be prepared to face. The storm was coming to Redemption Creek, but perhaps, just perhaps, they were about to learn that the fastest draw always strikes first. Halfway down the street, Deputy Miles Rodriguez hurried toward the sheriff, his young face flushed with excitement or concern, possibly both. Miles had been appointed deputy just 6 months prior, fresh-faced and eager, but showing a natural aptitude for the work that had impressed Ethan enough to take him on despite his youth. "Sheriff," Miles called, slightly out of breath as he approached. "Just got word from Jefferson at the telegraph office. Judge Harrison's train will arrive tomorrow morning, bringing the Cassidy brothers for trial." The deputy lowered his voice, glancing nervously at the growing number of unfamiliar faces gathering around Morgan's tavern. "Folks are getting anxious. Rumor is that Virgil Ward and his gang have been spotted 2 days' ride from here, burning through every settlement between here and Salt River Junction." Ethan nodded, his blue eyes never ceasing their methodical assessment of the street and its occupants. The Cassidy brothers had been part of Ward's operation before Ethan intercepted them during an attempted stagecoach robbery outside of town. Their capture had been clean, professional, 3 shots that had disabled both men without serious injury. But the speed of those shots, the impossible precision, had started whispers among those who'd witnessed it. As noon approached, the sun transformed Redemption Creek into a shimmering landscape of heat waves and dust. Ethan made his way to the jailhouse, the building's thick adobe walls providing blessed relief from the punishing temperature outside. Inside, the Cassidy brothers lounged in their cells, watching the sheriff with calculating eyes. "You really don't understand what you've done, do you?" Frank Cassidy said, moving to the iron bars, separating him from freedom. "You think catching us was some kind of victory? All you did was sign this town's death warrant." Ethan settled behind his desk, methodically organizing the paperwork for tomorrow's legal proceedings. "Is that what Ward tells his men? That they're indispensable, that he won't rest until they're free?" William Cassidy, the younger of the pair but by far the more dangerous, moved to the bars of his cell. "You've never seen what happens to those who cross him. Back in Santa Rosa, this shopkeeper refused to pay protection. Ward didn't just kill him. He spent a whole day destroying everything that man loved, piece by piece. Made sure the entire town watched. And you stood by while this happened," Ethan remarked, his tone conversational rather than accusatory. The brothers exchanged an uneasy glance. "You don't understand," Frank muttered. "With Ward, there's no choosing. You either follow orders or you're the example." "There's always a choice," Ethan replied, looking up from his papers for the first time. Something in his eyes, a calm, certainty that seemed to cut through their bravado, made both brothers take an involuntary step back from the bars. The jailhouse door opened to admit Jacob Forrest, the former marshal's weathered frame silhouetted against the bright sunlight. His cane tapped a deliberate rhythm as he made his way to a chair beside Ethan's desk. "Town's filling up," he observed, his voice carrying the rasping quality of a man who'd spent too many years shouting orders across windy plains. "Counted 23, strangers since breakfast. Most gathered at Morgan's, but they're starting to spread out, taking strategic positions." Miles, who had been inventorying ammunition supplies, looked up with alarm. 23? That many couldn't all be Ward's men, could they? "No," Ethan replied, his focus returning to his paperwork. "Some are Holt's connections. Others are just opportunists, drawn by the promise of chaos, vultures circling for whatever might be left when the dust settles." The casual confidence in his assessment did little to ease Miles's concern. "Sheriff, with those kinds of numbers, maybe we should consider asking for reinforcements from—" "From where?" Forrest interrupted. "Fort Mackenzie's dealing with Apache troubles up north. Marshal Givens in Tularosa is laid up with that bullet he took last month. By the time anyone could get here, this will all be over, one way or another." Outside, the midday stage arrived in a cloud of dust, disgorging passengers who quickly sought shelter from the heat. Samuel Wright stood in the doorway of his store, observing the newcomers with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen boom towns transform into ghost towns and back again. Eleanor Reed stepped out of her clinic, medical bag, in hand, and crossed the street toward the jailhouse. Her purposeful stride and the tight line of her mouth suggested news, none of it good. "Ethan," she said as she entered, nodding briefly to Forrest and Miles. "Just treated a man who came in on the stage. He was in Silver Cliff when Ward's gang hit it yesterday. The stories he told—" She hesitated, her professional composure momentarily cracking. "4 dead, including a child who was in the wrong place. The marshal there took 2 bullets trying to evacuate the general store. His deputy wasn't so fortunate." From their cells, the Cassidy brothers watched the exchange with growing interest. "Starting to understand now, lawman," Frank called out. "That's Ward's calling card. He doesn't just want his men back, he wants everyone to know the cost of crossing him." Eleanor turned toward the cells, her expression hardening. "I've treated men like your boss before. Men who mistake cruelty for strength, who think terror is the same as respect." Her voice, usually gentle when dealing with patients, carried an edge of steel. "They all bleed the same in the end." Outside, the heat of the day began to wane, but the tension in Redemption Creek only intensified. Luther Holt had established himself on the porch of Morgan's Tavern, occasionally sending messengers to different parts of town. Each time, a new face would appear at their assigned position, a roof here, an alley there, the stable loft overlooking the main street. Morgan himself had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the transformation of his establishment. What had started as a legitimate business serving miners and travelers had in the space of a day become the headquarters for what looked increasingly like an invasion force. "Don't like the feel of this, Luther," he muttered as he brought a bottle to Holt's table. "Town's been good to me. Don't want to see it shot to pieces." Holt's scarred face twisted into what might charitably be called a smile. "Then you should have thought twice before serving a lawman who crossed Virgil Ward. Now you're part of this, whether you like it or not." Decker, who sat at Holt's right, kept his own counsel, but his eyes continuously tracked movements through the tavern's windows. Unlike the others, who were focused solely on the jailhouse and the young sheriff, Decker had noticed Jacob Forrest's involvement, and that worried him. "That old man with the cane," he finally said, interrupting Holt's ongoing negotiations, "with yet another newly arrived gun hand. The one who keeps visiting the sheriff. You know who he is?" Holt shrugged dismissively. "Some washed-up old-timer. Why?" "Because if he's who I think he is, we might be underestimating our situation," Decker replied, his voice pitched low with concern. 20 years back, there was a marshal in New Mexico Territory. They called him Three-Finger Forrest on account of what was left of his right hand after a particular engagement with the Taylor gang. So, Holt's impatience was evident. So all 6 Taylor brothers went to the gallows. No one ever saw Forrest draw, but witnesses claimed it was like watching lightning strike 6 times in the exact same spot. Decker leaned forward. "If that's him, and he's mentoring our young sheriff." Holt waved away the concern. "He's an old man now, walks with a cane, and our sheriff is still green, no matter who's been telling him stories." As afternoon surrendered to evening, Ethan met with the town council in the back room of Wright's General Store. The 5 elected representatives of Redemption Creek's respectable citizens listened with increasing alarm as he outlined the situation. "So you're saying there's nothing to be done?" Thomas Fulton, the banker, asked incredulously. "We just wait for this outlaw to arrive and hope for the best?" Ethan shook his head. "I'm saying I need you and your families to stay indoors. Tomorrow, I need the streets clear, and I need to know exactly who I'm dealing with." Madeline Parker, who ran the town's small school, studied the young sheriff with shrewd eyes. Unlike the others, she'd known Ethan since he was a boy, had watched him grow from a quiet, bookish child into the composed man who now stood before them. "You have a plan," she stated, rather than asked. "I do," Ethan confirmed without elaborating. "And does this plan involve getting yourself killed?" She pressed. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. That's not part of the strategy, no. Back at the jailhouse, Miles was receiving unexpected instruction from Jacob Forrest. The old lawman had pushed the desk aside and was demonstrating a technique that seemed to involve drawing, firing, and reholstering in one fluid motion. "The trick isn't speed," Forrest explained, his gnarled hands moving with surprising grace despite his age. "It's economy, no wasted movement, no hesitation. You see the shot before you take it." Miles attempted to mimic the motion, his younger, reflexes quick, but lacking the smoothness of the old marshal's demonstration. "Better," Forrest nodded approvingly. "But you're still thinking about each step separately. It needs to become one continuous action, like breathing." The deputy was about to try again when Ethan returned, bringing with him the scent of the desert night that had settled over Redemption Creek. "Jacob," he acknowledged with a nod, "giving Miles a refresher course." "Figured it couldn't hurt," the old marshal replied. "Boy's got good instincts. Reminds me a bit of you when we started." In their cells, the Cassidy brothers had been following the exchange with growing unease. "You really think you can stand against Ward?" William asked, his earlier bravado noticeably diminished. "You and a raw deputy and an old man?" "Don't forget the town's doctor," Ethan replied mildly. "Eleanor's quite determined to be part of this as well." Frank gripped the bars of his cell. "This isn't a joke, lawman. Ward's bringing an army. We've seen him wipe out whole settlements with fewer men than he'll bring here." Ethan studied the brothers for a long moment. "Tell me something I've been wondering about. What made you ride with him in the first place? You don't seem like natural killers, either of you." The question caught them off guard. The brothers exchanged a glance loaded with unspoken history. "Started simple enough," Frank finally answered. "Our pa's ranch failed in the drought of 71. Ward offered protection, said he saw potential in us." He laughed bitterly. "Didn't realize the price until it was too late. By then we'd seen too much," William added, his voice hollow. "Done too much? There's no walking away from Ward's outfit. Not alive, anyway." Outside, Luther Holt was concluding the final arrangements for tomorrow's confrontation. 2 more stagecoaches had arrived after sunset, disgorging passengers who moved. With the telltale vigilance of men accustomed to violence, they reported directly to Holt, receiving assignments and taking up positions throughout the town. 32, Decker murmured, keeping his own mental count. 32 guns against a sheriff, a deputy, and an old man. 37 by morning, Holt corrected with satisfaction. Ward's sending 5 more with the dawn stage. By the time he arrives with his main force, this will all be over. Morgan, who had been listening from behind his bar, finally reached his breaking point. "This isn't what I signed on for, Luther. I agreed to let you use my place as a meeting point, not as a base for massacring the whole town." Holt's hand moved to his gun with practiced ease. "You signed on when you took my money, Morgan. Now you're in too deep to grow a conscience." As midnight approached, Eleanor Reed made her way to the jailhouse once more. She found Ethan sitting at his desk, writing in his logbook with the same meticulous care he applied to everything. "My clinic's prepared," she informed him, setting her medical bag on the corner of his desk. "Though I'm praying I won't need to use any of it tomorrow." Ethan closed his logbook and looked up at her. In the lamplight, his youthful features seemed more pronounced, a stark reminder of just how young he really was to be carrying such responsibility. "Your father would be proud, you know," she said softly. "The way you've stepped into this role, the way you've earned the town's respect." "Not everyone's respect," he replied with a small smile. "Those who matter," she countered. "Those who understand that true strength isn't about intimidation or fear." From the small window of his cell, Frank Cassidy watched the exchange with growing confusion. He'd seen Ward's brand of authority, the kind that demanded obedience through terror. He'd witnessed other lawmen who ruled through rigid enforcement of the letter of the law. But this quiet confidence, this gentle certainty in the face of overwhelming odds, this was something he'd never encountered before. "You really think you can win this, don't you?" he called out, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. Ethan turned toward the cell. "This isn't about winning, Mr. Cassidy. It's about justice. It's about showing that fear doesn't get to dictate how we live." As midnight chimed from the clock in the town square, Miles returned from his patrol, his young face serious with responsibility. "They've got men on every rooftop from the livery to the bank," he reported. "At least 8 more watching the back streets. Holt's coordinating everything from Morgan's place." Ethan nodded, unsurprised. "And our preparations?" "Just like you. Planned. Sarah's got the clinic ready, Wright's keeping count of every stranger who's bought supplies. Most families with children have either left town or are sheltering at the school with Mrs. Parker." Jacob Forrest entered, his cane tapping a slow rhythm on the wooden floor. Despite the late hour, his eyes were alert, his posture straight, despite his years. "Just heard from Jefferson at the telegraph office," he announced. "Judge Harrison's train left on schedule. Will arrive at Tengau tomorrow morning." The old marshal settled himself into a chair, his gaze moving between Ethan and the cells holding the Cassidy brothers. "Word is, Ward's main force was spotted, crossing the Salt River this afternoon. They'll be here by midday." The Cassidy brothers exchanged glances, a mixture of fear and resignation passing between them. "Last chance to ride out, Sheriff," Frank called. "No shame in living to fight another day." "He's right," William added with unexpected sincerity. "Ward won't stop with just you. Anyone who stands with you will pay the price. The whole town might burn for it." Ethan rose from his desk, checking his guns with those same methodical movements that made so many underestimate him. "I appreciate your concern, gentlemen," he replied, his voice carrying neither fear nor bravado. "But Redemption Creek is under my protection, and come tomorrow, Mr. Ward is going to learn exactly what that means." As the midnight hours stretched toward dawn, Redemption Creek held its breath. In the jailhouse, Ethan Caldwell prepared for the coming storm, his hands moving through practiced motions as old as the profession he'd chosen. Outside, under the star-filled Arizona sky, forces were gathering that would test not just his extraordinary speed, but the very foundations of justice in a land still struggling to define the meaning of the word. The young sheriff's hands checked, his revolvers one final time before he settled back in his chair to await the coming dawn. Tomorrow, Redemption Creek would witness firsthand the truth behind the whispers, the legend of the lightning-fast lawman who had made this frontier town his own. The first grey light of dawn crept over the eastern mountains, gradually illuminating Redemption Creek's main street. Thin wisps of smoke rose from chimneys as the town's early risers prepared for the day ahead. Though many had chosen to remain indoors, their windows shuttered despite the promise of increasing heat. Before you continue with this story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below, and if this tale of the lightning-fast sheriff has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe. We've saved something extraordinary for tomorrow that you won't want to miss. Ethan Caldwell stood on the jailhouse porch, watching the town come reluctantly to life. The past night had brought 5 more strangers on the midnight stage, all of them making their way directly to Morgan's Tavern before dispersing to their assigned positions. Now, in the half-light of early morning, he could see figures moving across rooftops, taking cover behind water barrels and chimneys. 37. Jacob Forrest announced, joining Ethan on the porch. The old marshal's experienced eyes had been counting as well. 37 guns that don't belong in this town, all waiting for you to make a mistake. Despite the gravity of his words, there was a hint of anticipation in his voice, the tension of a seasoned hunter who recognized the approaching moment of truth. 38 now. Ethan corrected quietly, noting a new arrival slipping into position near the livery stable, plus however many Ward brings with him. Inside the jailhouse, Miles Rodriguez was checking and rechecking his weapons, his young face set with determination that couldn't quite mask his anxiety. The deputy had shed his usual easygoing manner, replaced by a focus that transformed him from boy to man in the space of a night. "Everything ready?" Ethan asked, stepping back inside. Miles nodded. "Just like you planned, Sheriff. Sarah's keeping. The children secure at the schoolhouse. Mr. Wright closed his store, but he's watching from the second floor. Dr. Reed has her clinic prepared." He hesitated before adding, "She insisted on setting up a second treatment area in the church basement, just in case." From their cells, the Cassidy brothers had been observing the preparations with growing unease. Frank called out, "Last chance to save your skin, lawman. Leave that badge and ride out. Ward might even let you live if you don't make him work too." "Hard for it. That's your professional assessment, Mr. Cassidy?" Ethan asked mildly, checking his guns with those same precise movements that made so many underestimate him. Before Frank could answer, William spoke up, his voice carrying none of his brother's bravado. "I've ridden with Ward 4 years now. Seen what happens when someone stands against him. He doesn't just kill, he destroys everything you might care about. Make sure everyone learns the lesson. That's because fear is the only language he understands," Ethan replied, sliding his revolvers back into their holsters with fluid grace. "Today he's going to learn a new one." The morning stage was running early, its driver clearly anxious to deliver his passengers and leave before trouble started. The coach rattled down the main street in a cloud of dust, coming to a stop before Morgan's Tavern, rather than its usual position outside the Wells Fargo office. 4 men descended, their movements carrying the unmistakable wariness of experienced gun hands. Luther Holt emerged from the tavern to greet them, his scarred face set in a triumphant smirk as he conducted a brief conversation before dispatching them to their positions. His eyes frequently darted toward the jailhouse, measuring, calculating. Inside Morgan's, Silas Decker watched the proceedings with growing disquiet. Unlike Holt, whose confidence seemed to swell with each new arrival, the experienced gunman recognized the difference between quantity and quality. The men Holt had assembled were dangerous enough in normal circumstances, but there was something about the young sheriff's calm certainty that gnawed at Decker's instincts. "Think we need more men?" he asked Holt when the tavern keeper returned. Holt snorted dismissively. 42 guns against 3. I'd say we've got this well in hand." "You're forgetting Ward's force," Morgan interjected from behind the bar. "He'll want his cut of whatever's left when this is done. Ward gets what we agree he gets," Holt snapped. "This is my operation, my planning, my town when it's over." The conviction in his voice didn't quite reach his eyes, Decker noted. For all his bluster, Holt knew as well as anyone that Virgil Ward wasn't a man who settled for leftovers. At the jailhouse, Eleanor Reed arrived with fresh coffee and a determination that brooked no argument. "I'm staying," she announced, setting down a basket that suggested she'd prepared for more than just a brief visit. "Eleanor," Ethan began. "Don't waste your breath, son," Forrest interrupted with a knowing smile. "Reed women have always had minds of their own. Her mother was the same way during the troubles of '59. The doctor nodded gratefully at the old marshal before turning back to Ethan. "I've moved my most critical supplies here. If things go badly, this building has the thickest walls in town." "They won't go badly," Ethan replied, with that same quiet certainty that had begun to affect even the Cassidy brothers in their cells. "You still don't understand what's coming," Frank called out, his voice not quite as confident as before. "Ward brings destruction like I've never seen," Ethan finished for him. "Yes, you've mentioned that. Several times." Something in the sheriff's tone, not dismissive, but almost gently amused, seemed to penetrate Frank's bravado at last. He fell silent, exchanging a look with his brother that spoke volumes about their changing assessment of the situation. Outside, the town had fallen into an unnatural stillness. The usual morning activities, shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks, freight wagons delivering goods, children running errands, had all ceased. Only the occasional movement of Holt's men from one position to another disturbed the eerie quiet. Jefferson, from the telegraph office, hurried across the street, keeping close to the buildings, as if expecting trouble to erupt at any moment. His round face was flushed with exertion and worry as he handed Ethan a yellow slip of paper. "Just came. In," he panted. "Judge Harrison's train will arrive at 10 sharp. The territorial marshal is with him, heard about the situation, and decided to come personally." Hope flashed across Miles's young face. "That's good news, isn't it? The territorial marshal brings authority, maybe even men, one man, no matter. His title won't change the odds," Forrest interjected, "and his presence might just push Ward into more desperate action." Ethan studied the telegram before carefully folding it and placing it in his vest pocket. "Thank you, Jefferson. Best get back to your office and stay there until this is resolved." As the telegraph operator hurried away, Ethan turned to address his small group of defenders. "This ends before the judge arrives. I won't risk his life, or anyone else's who comes on that train." 42 against 3, Eleanor said quietly, echoing Holt's earlier assessment. "Those aren't odds, Ethan. That's suicide." A small smile touched the sheriff's lips. "Numbers don't matter much in this kind of fight, Eleanor, not when you know exactly what you're doing." "And you do," she challenged. "He does," Forrest confirmed, his weathered face showing absolute conviction. "Boy's got the fastest hands I've seen in 60 years wearing a badge. Faster than mine ever were, even in my prime." "It's not just about speed," Ethan corrected gently. "It's about knowing where to be, when to move, how to read a situation before it unfolds." He checked his pocket watch. "And right now, it's about dealing with Mr. Holt before Ward arrives to complicate matters." On the street, Luther Holt had emerged from Morgan's tavern, flanked by Decker and 3 other hard-looking men. They spread out across the dusty thoroughfare, positioning themselves in a loose semicircle that gave each man a clear line of fire toward the jailhouse. "Last chance, boy," Holt called out, his voice carrying in the morning stillness. "Throw out your badge, release the Cassidy brothers, and ride out. Might even put in a good word for you with Ward when he arrives." The jailhouse door opened. Ethan stepped onto the porch alone, his hands relaxed at his sides. The badge on his vest caught the morning light, a small silver star that suddenly seemed to carry the weight of all the law in the territory. "Mr. Holt," Ethan replied, his voice carrying clearly without being raised, "I'm only going to say this once. You and your friends have 1 hour to leave Redemption Creek. After that, I'll be forced to take action." Laughter erupted from Holt's men, a harsh sound that echoed off the silent buildings. "You hear that, boys?" Holt called out, playing to his audience. "The bookkeeper's son is giving us an ultimatum." He gestured expansively toward the rooftops and alleyways where his men were positioned. "In case you haven't noticed, Sheriff, you're a little outnumbered." "Numbers aren't everything, Mr. Holt," Ethan replied calmly. "Quality matters more than quantity, so does positioning." He nodded almost imperceptibly. From his vantage point on the general store's roof, Samuel Wright squeezed the trigger of an old Sharps rifle. The shot echoed through the street like a thunderclap, kicking up dust at Holt's feet with surgical precision. Before anyone could react, 2 more shots rang out. One from the church bell tower, where the town undertaker had taken position. Another from behind the livery stable, where one of Wright's sons had been waiting patiently since dawn. Both bullets struck with uncanny accuracy, one removing Decker's hat, the other kicking up dirt between the feet of Holt's rightmost companion. "That's 3 shots, Mr. Holt," Ethan called out, his voice unchanged despite the sudden eruption of Gunfire, 3 shots that could have ended 3 lives but didn't. That's the difference between justice and vengeance, a lesson Mr. Ward never learned. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Holt's scarred face. "Wilson, Jensen!" he shouted to men positioned on nearby rooftops. "Take out those shooters!" Before his men could comply, Ethan's hands moved. Later, witnesses would disagree about exactly what they saw in that moment. Some would swear the sheriff's hands never even seemed to touch his guns. Others would claim they saw a blur of movement too fast for the eye to follow. What no one disputed was the result. 6 shots rang out in such rapid succession they seemed to merge into a single extended report. 6 men on 6 different rooftops suddenly found themselves holding weapons that had been rendered useless. Firing mechanisms shot away with impossible precision, barrels split as if by some machinist's tool rather than a bullet. Silence fell over the street, more profound than before. Even the wind seemed to pause. "That's 9, Mr. Holt," Ethan stated into the stunned quiet. 9 shots that disabled 9 weapons without harming a single man. Would you like to see what happens when we reach 20? Decker was the first to recover, his professional instincts overriding his shock. "No one's that fast," he muttered, staring at Ethan with new eyes. "No one human, anyway." "Someone is," Jacob Forrest called from the jailhouse doorway, pride evident in his voice. "Now you understand what you're facing. This isn't some green lawman you can intimidate. This is lightning in human form." Inside their cells, the Cassidy brothers had pressed against the bars, straining to see what was happening outside. "Did you see that?" William whispered, awe replacing fear in his voice. "Like nothing I've ever seen," Frank responded, his face pale. "Not even in those dime novels." Eleanor moved to the window, medical bag clutched tight, though it seemed increasingly unlikely she would need it. "It's working," she breathed. "They're backing down." Indeed, several of Holt's men had begun to withdraw from their positions, slipping away down alleys or edging toward the livery stable where horses waited. Others stood frozen, weapons half raised, unsure whether to flee or fight. Holt himself seemed unable to process what he'd just witnessed, his scarred face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "This is some kind of trick," he snarled, hand hovering near his gun. "No trick, Mr. Holt," Ethan replied. "Just the consequence of spending 5 years practicing the same shot 10, 1,000 times, while men like you were building reputations in saloons." His hands remained relaxed at his sides, but something in his posture had changed. A subtle shift from patience to readiness. "Now about that hour I offered you..." The standoff stretched for a heartbeat, then 2, then Decker, whose survival instincts had kept him alive through 2 decades as a gun for hire, slowly raised his hands. "I'm out," he announced clearly. "No shame in walking away from certain death." "Coward," Holt spat, but his bravado had a hollow ring to it now. "Realist," Decker corrected, backing away. "I've seen what happens when a man faces someone faster than human reflex. It never ends well for the slower man." He turned to the remaining gunmen. "Anyone with sense will ride out now, before Ward arrives and makes it impossible to leave." His words struck a chord. 3 more men immediately backed away, then another. 4. Within minutes, the street had begun to clear as Holt's carefully assembled force dissolved before his eyes. "This isn't over," Holt growled, but even he seemed to recognize the shifting tide. With a final venomous glare at Ethan, he turned and stalked back toward Morgan's Tavern, his remaining loyalists following in his wake. "That won't last," Forrest observed as Ethan returned to the jailhouse. "Holt's pride won't let him walk away." "Completely, and Ward's still coming with his main force." "I know," Ethan replied, checking his guns and reloading with those same precise movements that seemed too deliberate for the speed he'd just demonstrated. "But we've thinned their numbers and shown them what they're facing. Fear works both ways." "Jacob, you learned well." The old marshal nodded approvingly. Eleanor stared at Ethan with new eyes. I've seen you handle trouble before, but nothing like this. Where did you learn to shoot like that? Jacob started teaching me the fundamentals when I was 16, Ethan replied, nodding toward the former marshal. But the speed, that was always there. A gift, Jacob called it, or a curse, depending on your perspective. Miles, who had watched the entire confrontation from the jailhouse window, looked at his mentor with undisguised awe. I counted the shots, 6 in less than 2 seconds, and everyone hitting exactly where you aimed, not the men, but their weapons. That's the harder part, Ethan acknowledged. Anyone can learn to shoot fast with enough practice. Shooting fast and accurate, that takes something more. From their cells, the Cassidy brothers had fallen into a contemplative silence, their earlier bravado replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. Ward doesn't know what he's riding into, William finally said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been hope. Nobody could have told him about this. Would it matter if they had? Frank countered. You know Ward. He'd just bring more men, more guns. Numbers don't matter, William replied, unconsciously echoing Ethan's earlier words. Not against something like that. Outside, Redemption Creek had fallen into an uneasy lull. Holt's remaining men had gathered at Morgan's tavern, while others had slipped away toward the livery stable or the town's outskirts. The confrontation had revealed a fundamental truth that had shifted the balance of power. In Redemption Creek, the young sheriff was not the easy target they had anticipated. But as the morning sun climbed higher, a new dust cloud appeared on the horizon. The judge's train was still an hour away, but another arrival was imminent. Virgil Ward was coming, bringing his reputation for unchecked brutality with him, unaware that in Redemption Creek, lightning had already struck and was prepared to strike again. The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger, announcing the approach of riders from the east. From his position on the jailhouse porch, Ethan studied the formation through a brass spyglass. 12 men riding in a disciplined arrangement that spoke of military experience or, at minimum, someone who understood tactical advantage. Ward? Miles asked, the single word carrying a weight of tension. Ethan collapsed the spyglass with a precise snap. His advance party, scout riders and sharpshooters, based on the rifle scabbards. Jacob Forrest nodded grimly. Smart. He's testing our defenses before committing his main force. The approaching riders slowed as they reached the outskirts of Redemption Creek, spreading into a wider formation that would allow them to enter the town from multiple directions. Their leader, a lean, silver-haired man with a prominent scar, running from temple to jaw, raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt just beyond rifle range. In Morgan's tavern, Luther Holt watched the arrival with growing apprehension. Whatever confidence he'd projected earlier had diminished with each man who had abandoned his cause after Ethan's demonstration. Now, seeing Ward's advanced scouts, he drained his whiskey glass in a single swallow. Looks like Ward sent Reeves to check things out, Decker observed, recognizing the silver-haired rider. Man's reputation is nearly as bad as Ward's. They say he lost that eye in a knife fight with 3 Apache warriors, killed all 3 with his bare hands afterward. Morgan wiped down the bar with nervous energy. Maybe time to reconsider our position, Luther. Ward's men aren't known for distinguishing between allies and obstacles when trouble starts. Before Holt could respond, the tavern door swung open. 3 riders entered, not Ward's approaching scouts, but men who had fled Holt's force after. Witnessing Ethan's impossible speed, their expressions carried a mixture of amazement and fear. You didn't tell us what we were facing, Holt, the leader said, his voice pitched low to avoid being overheard outside. That ain't no ordinary lawman. Holt's scarred face twisted with anger. What are you talking about, Cooper? It's just one man with a badge. Cooper shook his head. One man who can draw and fire 6 shots before a man can blink. 6 shots that hit exactly where he aims them every time. He leaned closer. You ever see a man shoot the firing pin off a revolver at 50 paces? Because I just did. At the jailhouse, Ethan completed his preparations with the same deliberate care that characterized all his movements. The Cassidy brothers watched in silence from their cells, their earlier bravado replaced by a wary respect. "Those are Reeves's men approaching," Frank finally said. "Ward's chief enforcer. Never seen him fail on an assignment." "First time for everything, Mr. Cassidy," Ethan replied mildly, checking the loads in his second revolver. "Why not just kill them?" William asked, the question seeming to surprise even himself. "Why go to the trouble of shooting weapons instead of men? It would be easier." Ethan looked up, studying the younger Cassidy for a moment. "Easier, yes, but that's not why I wear this badge." He tapped the silver star on his vest. "This isn't a license to kill. It's a responsibility to protect. Even those who may not deserve it." William fell silent, exchanging a glance with his brother that spoke volumes. Outside, the silver-haired rider, Reeves, separated from his men and approached alone, his horse moving at a deliberate walk down the center of the main street. He stopped 30 yards from the jailhouse, just close enough for conversation without shouting, but far enough to give him reaction time if needed. "You the lawman causing all this trouble?" Reeves called, his voice carrying a harsh rasp that matched his weathered appearance. Ethan stepped onto the porch, hands resting comfortably at his sides. "Sheriff Ethan Caldwell, you're on private property, Mr. Reeves." A flicker of surprise crossed the man's scarred face at being recognized. "Got a reputation, do I?" "4 warrants in 3 territories," Ethan replied evenly. "Wanted for murder in Santa Fe. Specializes in intimidation and clearing obstacles for Virgil Ward's operations, as I recall." The casual recitation of his criminal history seemed to amuse rather than anger Reeves. "Well informed for a backwater. Lawman, then you know what's coming." He gestured toward the hills to the east. "Ward's bringing 30 men, all of them killers who enjoy their work. He sent me with a simple message. Release the Cassidy brothers and leave your badge, or we burn this town to the ground, starting with the schoolhouse." The threat hung in the air, but Ethan's expression remained unchanged. "Mr. Reeves, I'm only going to say this once. Take your men and leave. Tell Ward that Redemption Creek isn't like other towns he's terrorized." Reeves's laugh was as dry as desert wind. "What makes it so special? The boy sheriff with his badge and books, these townsfolk who'll scatter at the first sign of real trouble." "Lightning strikes here," Jacob Forrest called from the jailhouse doorway, his weathered face set in a knowing smile. "Fastest draw you'll ever see, if you live to see it at all." Reeves's expression hardened. "Prove it." The challenge hung in the air like a physical thing. Behind Reeves, his men had spread out, fingers resting near triggers, ready to provide, covering fire if needed. From rooftops and windows throughout the town, the remnants of Holt's force watched with renewed interest, wondering if the rumors about the sheriff's impossible speed were true. "That wouldn't be wise, Mr. Reeves," Ethan said quietly. "Not afraid, are you, lawman?" Reeves taunted, his hand hovering near his holster. What happened next became the first chapter in what would later be known as the lightning legend of redemption. Creek. Reeves went for his gun, a famously quick draw that had ended the lives of 14 men across the territory. But Ethan's hands moved with such blinding speed, they seemed to blur. 3 shots rang out in a single heartbeat, the sound merging into one sharp crack that echoed off the buildings. Reeves stood frozen, his prized Colt in pieces at his feet. His men found their weapons similarly disabled, firing mechanisms. Shot away with surgical precision, barrels split lengthwise. Not a drop of blood had been spilled, but the message was unmistakable. "Impossible," Reeves whispered, staring at his ruined gun like a man encountering something beyond his comprehension. "No one's that fast, no one's that accurate." "Someone is," Forrest called from the porch, pride evident in his voice. "Now take that warning back to Ward. Tell him what you saw. Tell him what's waiting." As Reeves retreated, visibly shaken, Maria Sanchez emerged from her restaurant, her dark eyes fixed on Ethan. "Ward won't be scared off by this, Sheriff," she said quietly. "He'll come harder now. More men, more guns, more evil in his heart." "I'm counting on it," Ethan replied, checking his guns with those same fluid movements that had just amazed everyone watching. "Some men need to learn the hard way. Best it happens here, where the odds favor justice for once." Inside their cells, the Cassidy brothers pressed against the bars, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. "Did you see?" William whispered, fear and awe mixing in his voice. 3 shots before Reeves could even clear leather, and he hit the firing pins, Frank, the firing pins. "Like nothing I've ever seen," Frank responded, his face pale with realization. "Not even Ward can draw that fast." The town buzzed with renewed energy following the confrontation. Those who had witnessed Ethan's demonstration spread the word, descriptions growing more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed the sheriff had fired 5 shots, others swore it was 7. All agreed on one thing: they had never seen anything like it. Luther Holt paced Morgan's tavern, his earlier confidence shattered. "This changes everything," he muttered, more to himself than to Decker or the remaining gunmen. "Ward needs to know what he's riding into." "Ward won't back down," Decker replied, his professional assessment cutting through Holt's growing panic. "Man like that with his reputation, he'll just bring more firepower." Morgan, who had been watching the street through his window, interrupted. "Reeves and his men are pulling out, heading east, probably to meet Ward's main force." "Good," Holt decided, a new calculation forming. "Let Ward handle the sheriff. We'll position ourselves to pick up the pieces afterward." At the jailhouse, Miles was still coming to terms with what he'd witnessed. 3 shots in less than a second, he kept repeating, "and you hit exactly what you aimed for. Not the men, their weapons. The guns are the threat, not the men themselves," Ethan explained, reloading with methodical precision. "Remove the threat without taking lives when possible. That's the difference between justice and vengeance." Eleanor Reed arrived with fresh bandages, though thus far they remained unnecessary. "Word spreading through town like wildfire," she reported. "Half the people think you're some kind of miracle. The other half think you made a deal with the devil." "Neither," Ethan replied with a small smile. "Just a lot of practice and a gift for seeing shots before they happen." "Still," Forrest interjected, "you've bought us valuable time. Reeves will report back to Ward, and even a man like that will approach more cautiously once he knows what he's facing." The old marshal's prediction proved accurate. The dust cloud on the horizon had halted its progress, suggesting that Reeves had indeed intercepted Ward's main force to deliver his report. The temporary respite allowed Ethan to complete his defensive preparations, positioning the few willing townspeople who could handle a rifle at key vantage points throughout Redemption Creek. Samuel Wright, whose skill with a long gun had earned him respect during the Apache troubles years earlier, took up position in his store's second-floor window, covering the eastern approach. Maria's husband, Carlos, a former Mexican cavalry soldier, positioned himself on the church roof with a Sharps rifle that could reach targets at extraordinary distances. As noon approached, the waiting grew almost unbearable. Even the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, the usual wind dying away to leave Redemption Creek in a pocket of unnatural stillness. "They're coming," Miles announced from his lookout position. "A lot of riders, 25, maybe 30. Ethan joined him at the window, studying the approaching force through his spyglass. Unlike Reeves's disciplined scouts, this group rode in a looser formation, a dark line of men and horses that spread across the horizon like an advancing storm. "That's Ward in the center," Frank Cassidy called from his cell, having glimpsed the approaching riders. "Black duster, silver conches on his hatband," William added, his voice hollow. "The man riding to his right is Casey Blackburn. Used to be a cavalry sergeant before he discovered he preferred killing to soldiering. Left side is probably Ezra Tull, Ward's tracker. Man can follow a butterfly through a thunderstorm. Ethan nodded, absorbing the information without comment. As he continued his assessment, Ward's force was impressive, well-armed, well-mounted, and projecting an aura of confidence that came from never having met defeat. But there was a change in their approach from what the Cassidy brothers had described. Instead of charging in with guns blazing, they maintained a deliberate pace. Riders spread out to minimize vulnerability. "They know," Forrest observed. "Reeves told them what he saw, and they're approaching with caution. That's new for Ward's outfit." "Good," Ethan replied, checking his guns one final time. "Fear works both ways." As Ward's force reached the outskirts of town, they split into smaller groups, each taking different routes toward the center. The tactical discipline suggested Ward was treating this confrontation with a seriousness he rarely displayed. The man himself, visible now without the aid of a spyglass, cut an imposing figure. Virgil Ward rode a massive black stallion, his long duster flapping slightly in the resumed desert breeze. The silver conches on his hatband and gunbelt caught the midday sun, and even at a distance there was no mistaking the aura of absolute authority he projected. Ward halted his horse in the center of the main street, his men forming a loose semicircle behind him. The positioning was deliberate, close enough to provide covering fire, far enough apart that they couldn't all be targeted at once. "That the one causing all my trouble?" Ward called, his voice surprisingly cultured for a man with his reputation. "It looks more like a schoolboy than a lawman to me." Ethan stepped onto the jailhouse porch, hands relaxed at his sides. "Mr. Ward, I presume. You're on private property. I'm going to have to ask you and your men to disarm and leave Redemption Creek immediately." An appreciative chuckle rippled through Ward's men at the audacity of the demand. Ward himself smiled, though the expression didn't reach his cold eyes. "Bold request from a man so severely outnumbered," he observed. "I've got 30 men who'd be happy to show you the error of your ways." "Numbers aren't everything, Mr. Ward," Ethan replied calmly. "As your man Reeves discovered." Ward's smile faltered slightly at the mention of his scout. "Reeves has always been impressionable, easily confused by theatrics and tricks." His gaze swept the town, noting positions, calculating angles. "I'm more interested in reality, Sheriff. And the reality is I've come for my men. The Cassidy brothers ride with me. That's non-negotiable. They're in custody awaiting trial for armed robbery and attempted murder," Ethan replied. "The judge arrives on the 10 o'clock train. Justice will take its course." "Justice?" Ward's laugh was as cold as a winter wind. "Out here I'm justice. My word, my law." His hand moved to rest on his ornate revolver. "Last chance, boy. Release my men, step aside, and I might let your precious town stand." The tension stretched between them, two forces of nature preparing to collide. On rooftops and behind windows, the townspeople who had chosen to stand with Ethan waited, fingers resting near triggers. In the jailhouse, Miles and Forrest positioned themselves to provide covering fire if needed. Eleanor Reed whispered a prayer from the back room, and the Cassidy brothers watched with mounting disbelief as a single lawman stood against the most feared outlaw in the territory. "Mr. Ward," Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly despite its conversational tone, "I'm going to count to 3. At that point, I expect you and your men to place your weapons on the ground and surrender peacefully." Genuine amusement crossed Ward's face. "You truly are delusional, aren't you? 30 armed men against one lawman, and you're making demands." "1," Ethan began, his hands still relaxed at his sides. Ward's amusement shifted toward irritation. "Boys, it seems our young sheriff needs a demonstration of reality. Show him what happens to men who don't know their place." 2. Ethan continued, undeterred. Ward's patience evaporated. "Enough of this farce. Take him." The first shot came not from Ward or Ethan, but from a nervous gunman on Ward's right flank. The bullet kicked up dust near Ethan's feet, and the moment of truth had arrived. What happened next would be told and retold across the territory for decades to come, growing with each telling until it passed from history into legend. But the core truth remained unchanged. On that day in Redemption Creek, human limits were shattered by a display that defied belief. Ethan's hands moved with such supernatural speed, they seemed to blur in the midday sun. 7 shots rang out. Before the echo of the first bullet faded, 7 of Ward's men found themselves staring at ruined weapons, the precise shots having disabled firing mechanisms or split barrels without harming the wielders. Ward's own first draw was intercepted, mid-motion, his ornate revolver suddenly missing its hammer, rendered useless by a shot so precisely placed it seemed impossible. For perhaps the first time in his violent career, genuine shock registered on Virgil Ward's face as he stared at his disabled weapon. "What in God's name?" he whispered, the words barely audible. "That's 8, Ethan stated calmly, his voice carrying in the stunned silence that had fallen over the street. 8 shots that could have taken lives, but instead only took. Weapons? Care to see what happens when we reach 30? For several heartbeats, absolute silence gripped Redemption Creek. Virgil Ward's face cycled through expressions, disbelief, rage, and finally a cold calculation that Eleanor recognized all too well from treating men with similar dispositions. "Impressive," Ward finally said, his cultured voice belying the fury in his eyes. "But can you maintain that speed against all my men? Sooner or later even you must tire." He gestured broadly to his remaining gunmen. "Boys, let's show the sheriff what real determination looks like." Before his men could comply, new shots rang out from the town's defenders. From the church steeple, Carlos Sanchez's Sharps rifle boomed, disabling a weapon in the hands of Ward's left flank rider. From the general store, Samuel Wright's shot struck with similar precision, rendering another gun useless. "That's 10. Forrest called from the jailhouse doorway, pride evident in his weathered voice. "Care to try for 20? Ward's remaining men exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence evaporating in the face of this unprecedented opposition. A few began to back their horses away, instinct for survival overriding loyalty. "Stand your ground," Ward commanded. But the authority that had kept men in line through fear was rapidly diminishing. Ethan's hands moved once more, impossibly fast. 5 more shots rang out in rapid succession, each finding its mark with surgical precision. More weapons disabled, more men left staring in disbelief at useless metal in their hands. 15, Ethan stated calmly, reloading with those same fluid movements that seemed too graceful for their lethal potential. "Mr. Ward, I believe the odds are shifting." Luther Holt, watching from Morgan's Tavern, saw opportunity in the changing dynamics. "Now, while they're distracted," he muttered to his remaining loyalists, "we hit them from behind, take control of this situation." Decker grabbed Holt's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't be a fool. You saw what the sheriff can do. You really want to place yourself between him and Ward?" "I want what's mine," Holt snarled, wrenching free. "This town, the Cassidy brothers as leverage. Ward's failing. I can see it in his men's eyes." Before Decker could respond, Morgan stepped between them. "Listen," he said, pointing toward the western edge of town. The distant whistle of an approaching train cut through the tense silence. The 10 o'clock from Santa Fe was arriving, carrying Judge Harrison and the territorial marshal, and potentially dozens of innocent passengers who would step into a war zone. In the street, Ward heard it too. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition that time was no longer his ally. "Last warning, lawman," he called, desperation creeping into his voice. "Stand down, or I'll burn this town to ashes." "You're welcome to try, Mr. Ward," Ethan replied, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the escalating situation. "But you're running out of both weapons and options." Fury transformed Ward's features into something barely human. "Miller!" he shouted to a rider on his right flank. "The backup plan!" The man nodded grimly before spurring his horse toward the eastern end of town. 3 more riders broke formation to follow him, clearly executing a pre-arranged strategy. Ethan's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The schoolhouse," he said quietly. "They're going after the children." Inside the jailhouse, William Cassidy pressed against the bars of his cell. "He'll do it," he called out, his voice carrying genuine alarm. Ward always has contingencies. When direct confrontation fails, he strikes at what people value most. The real test had arrived: speed versus strategy, precision versus threat. Ethan turned to Miles, his usual measured demeanor sharpened with urgency. "Cover the street," he instructed. "Jacob, keep Ward contained. I'll handle Miller." The young sheriff moved with purpose down the back stairs of the jailhouse, emerging into the alley behind. Unlike his usual unhurried pace, Ethan now demonstrated a different aspect of his extraordinary abilities. Not just the lightning draw, but a fluid speed of movement that carried him through the town's back paths like a desert wind. In the main street, Ward recognized the sheriff's absence immediately. "Now!" he shouted to his remaining men. "While he's gone!" Jacob Forrest, despite his age and infirmity, stepped onto the jailhouse porch, a Winchester repeater cradled in his arms with the comfortable familiarity of an old friend. "I wouldn't," the former marshal advised, his weathered voice carrying the authority earned through decades of facing down men like Ward. "Sheriff Caldwell isn't the only one who knows how to handle trouble." To emphasize his point, the old lawman fired 3 shots in rapid succession, not with the supernatural speed Ethan had demonstrated, but with the practiced precision of experience. 3 more of Ward's men found their weapons disabled, reinforcing the message that the young sheriff wasn't acting alone. "Impossible," one of Ward's riders muttered, staring at his ruined rifle. "The whole damn town shoots like this." At the eastern edge of Redemption Creek, Miller and his companions approached the schoolhouse at a gallop, confident in their ability to take hostages that would force the sheriff to surrender. The building sat slightly apart from the main settlement, a simple wooden structure with a small bell tower and large windows designed to catch the desert light. Miller gestured for his men to surround the building. "Remember, we want them alive," he instructed. "Children make the best leverage." Tut! Riders dismounted, drawing weapons as they approached the schoolhouse doors. The unusual silence, no children's voices, no schoolmistress calling for order, should have warned them. But the men were too focused on their objective to recognize the trap until it was too late. As Miller reached for the door handle, a voice called from behind them, "Gentlemen, I'd reconsider that course of action." The 4 men spun to find Ethan Caldwell standing 20 paces away, his hands relaxed at his sides in that deceptively casual posture that had become legendary in the past hours. "How did you—" Miller began, genuine confusion in his voice. No man could have outrun horses, especially taking the longer route around the town's perimeter. "The children were moved to safety last night," Ethan informed them, his voice carrying neither anger nor triumph, just the calm certainty that had unnerved so many. "This building is empty," Miller recovered quickly, a cruel smile spreading across his face. 4 against 1, lawman. Even with your speed, those aren't odds I'd take." "I don't recall offering you a choice, Mr. Miller," Ethan replied. What happened next seemed to defy the very laws of nature. Miller and his men went for their guns, a coordinated move that should have given them the advantage despite Ethan's reputation. But the sheriff's hands moved with that same impossible speed, appearing to blur before their eyes. 4 shots rang out, so close together they seemed to merge into a single extended report. 4 men found themselves holding useless metal, their weapons disabled, with the same surgical precision that had become Ethan's signature. 19, Ethan counted quietly. Now about those children you came to threaten. Miller's face drained of color. What are you? He whispered, staring at the young sheriff with genuine fear. Just a man doing his job, Ethan replied, gesturing toward the main street with his still smoking revolver. Now move! Back at the center of town, Ward's situation had deteriorated further. More of his men had broken ranks, unwilling to face odds that seemed increasingly supernatural. The train whistle sounded again, closer now, adding urgency to the confrontation. It's over, Ward, Forrest called from the jailhouse porch, where he and Miles maintained their defensive position. Your men are deserting. Your weapons are disabled. The judge and territorial marshal will be here any minute. Ward's face contorted with rage and desperation. Nothing's over until I say it is, he snarled, reaching for something inside his duster, a hidden derringer, a last resort weapon. His hand had barely cleared the fabric when Ethan appeared at the corner of the street. Miller and his chastened companions walking ahead of him with hands raised. The sheriff's impossible speed had brought him back to the confrontation in time to witness Ward's final desperate move. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, Ward's derringer and Ethan's Colt. Ward's bullet went wide, kicking up dust near the jailhouse steps. Ethan's shot, with that same supernatural precision, split the derringer's barrel lengthwise, rendering it useless without harming the man who held it. 20, Ethan announced calmly, into the stunned silence that followed. That's 20 weapons disabled, Mr. Ward. Would you care to try for more? The legendary outlaw stared at the ruined derringer in his hand, genuine fear replacing his usual cold confidence. For perhaps the first time in his violent career, Virgil Ward found himself completely outmatched, not by superior numbers or firepower, but by a speed and precision that seemed to transcend human limitation. You could have killed us all, he said quietly, the realization finally penetrating his understanding. Every shot! You could have killed instead of disarmed. I could have, Ethan acknowledged, holstering his weapon with fluid grace. But that's the difference between justice and vengeance, Mr. Ward. The distinction you never learned to recognize. The train whistle sounded a 3rd time, announcing its imminent arrival at the Redemption Creek station. From the west end of town, the sound of the locomotive's approach mingled with the tense silence of the standoff's conclusion. Ward's remaining men, seeing their leader's defeat, began to dismount, placing their weapons on the ground without being instructed. The message had been delivered with undeniable clarity. In Redemption Creek, a different kind of law held sway, one enforced by a man whose abilities defied explanation. It's over, Virgil, Reeves said, the scout having returned in time to witness the final confrontation. Time to recognize when you're beaten. For a moment, it seemed Ward might make one last futile stand. Then his shoulders slumped as the fight drained out of him. He extended his wrists, a gesture of surrender that seemed impossible from a man who had terrorized 3 territories. They'll tell stories about this day, he said as Ethan approached with handcuffs. About how Virgil Ward was brought down by a small-town sheriff. Yes, Ethan agreed, securing the restraints with methodical precision, but not the kind of stories you're accustomed to. These will be about choice, about restraint, about justice that doesn't require bloodshed. As Miles and Forrest began securing the remaining prisoners, Eleanor emerged from the jailhouse, her medical bag clutched tight though it remained remarkably unused. Not a single casualty, she marveled, surveying the scene. 20 armed men neutralized without a drop of blood spilled. I've never seen anything like it. Few have, Forrest replied, pride evident in his weathered voice. The boy's gift isn't Just speed. It's knowing exactly where to place each shot. That's the real miracle we witnessed today. The train pulled into the station, its brakes squealing as it slowed to a stop. Judge Harrison, a dignified man in his 60s, descended first, followed by the imposing figure of the territorial marshal. They surveyed the scene with evident surprise. Instead of the bloodbath they had clearly expected, they found an orderly procession of disarmed men being led toward the jailhouse. "Sheriff Caldwell, I presume," the judge called, approaching with cautious optimism. "I was told to expect difficulties." "All resolved, Your Honor," Ethan replied with characteristic understatement. "The Cassidy brothers are secured for trial, along with Mr. Ward and several of his associates. The charges will include attempted robbery, assault, and conspiracy." The territorial marshal, a veteran lawman whose scarred face spoke of countless violent encounters, studied the young sheriff with open curiosity. "Heard some wild tales on our way here, about a lawman with hands faster than human sight, about shots that disable weapons without harming men." "People do tend to exaggerate, Marshal," Ethan replied with a small smile. "Do they now?" the marshal countered, gesturing toward the street littered with disabled weapons. "Looks to me like the stories might have understated things." As the prisoners were secured in the jailhouse and temporary holding areas arranged in the sturdy stone basement of the bank, the town of Redemption Creek began to emerge from hiding. Shopkeepers cautiously reopened their doors, families ventured out into the midday sun, and the schoolchildren, safely returned from their shelter in the mine outside town, played in the schoolyard as if nothing unusual had occurred. In the jailhouse, the Cassidy brothers watched the proceedings with a mixture of awe and something that looked remarkably like respect. "Been riding with Ward for 4 years, William said quietly to his brother. "Seen him face down posses, marshals, even that Pinkerton crew in Tucson. Never seen him surrender. Not once." Frank nodded. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. "What we saw today, that wasn't just speed, that was something else entirely. Something worth thinking about," William replied, a thoughtfulness in his expression that hadn't been there before. "About choices. About what strength really means." Outside, Luther Holt had surrendered without resistance, his dreams of controlling Redemption Creek shattered by the day's events. Decker, ever the pragmatist, had ridden out as soon as it became clear which way the wind was blowing, heading west toward new opportunities and perhaps a reconsideration of his choice of profession. As evening approached, Ethan sat on the jailhouse porch, his usual calm restored now that the crisis had passed. Eleanor joined him, offering a cup of coffee, which he accepted with a grateful nod. "The whole town's talking about you," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "About what?" "You did today. Some are calling it a miracle." "No miracle," Ethan replied, sipping the strong brew. "Just preparation meeting opportunity, and good people willing to stand for what's right, even when the odds seemed impossible." Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. "You know they'll come, don't you? Men looking to test the legend, gunslingers wanting to prove themselves against the lightning-fast sheriff of Redemption Creek." "Probably," he acknowledged with a small smile, "though after today I suspect many will reconsider the wisdom of such ambitions." From inside the jailhouse, they could hear Judge Harrison and the territorial marshal discussing the day's events in tones of continued disbelief. The judge's voice carried through the open window. "In 30 years on the bench, I've never seen anything like it. 42 men neutralized without a single fatality. It defies explanation." "Not explanation," the marshal replied. "Just human limitation. Some men are simply blessed with abilities beyond the ordinary. The wise ones use those gifts for justice rather than personal gain." As darkness settled over Redemption Creek, the town began to process what had transpired. In saloons and homes alike, The tale of the lightning-fast sheriff was already growing in the telling. How he had faced down Virgil Ward's entire gang, how he had fired shots so precise they split gun barrels lengthwise, how he had moved with a speed that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. But beneath the embellishments lay a simple truth that would form the core of every retelling in the years to come. On that day, in Redemption Creek, justice had prevailed not through superior firepower or bloodshed, but through one man's extraordinary ability and unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent. The legend of Sheriff Ethan Caldwell was born not in violence, but in the remarkable absence of it. In a land where strength was typically measured by how many men you could kill, he had demonstrated a different kind of power altogether. The strength to choose mercy over vengeance, precision over destruction, and justice over fear. And as the stars emerged above the desert landscape, Redemption Creek settled into a peace it had never truly known before. A peace built not on intimidation, but on the knowledge that true authority comes not from the ability to take life, but from the wisdom to preserve it whenever possible. The lightning had struck in Redemption Creek, and in its wake, a new understanding of justice had taken root, one that would spread through the territory like ripples in a desert pool, changing not just one town, but the very meaning of law in a land still struggling to define itself. 1 week after Virgil Ward's capture, Redemption Creek bustled with an energy it had never known before. The main street, once tense with the anticipation of violence, now hummed with commerce and conversation as residents and visitors alike moved freely through a town that had claimed its own unique place in frontier legend. If you've enjoyed this story of lightning-fast justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us which part was your favorite. Tomorrow, we've got another tale of extraordinary courage waiting for you that you won't want to miss. Sheriff Ethan Caldwell sat at his desk in the jailhouse, reviewing correspondence that had accumulated since news of the confrontation spread throughout the territory. Letters had arrived from 3 neighboring communities requesting his assistance with their own troublesome situations. 2 more had come from territorial officials, including a personal note from the governor expressing admiration for how the situation had been resolved without bloodshed. Most surprising was the pile of applications from young men eager to serve as deputies under the sheriff, whose reputation now extended far beyond Redemption Creek's boundaries. Another batch arrived on the morning stage, Miles announced, setting a fresh stack of envelopes on the corner of Ethan's desk. The young deputy had grown in confidence since the confrontation, carrying himself with a new sense of purpose. Words, "Spreading faster than we thought," Ethan nodded, selecting one of the letters and breaking its seal. "Marshal Givens writes that he's never seen anything like it. Says the prisoners arrived at the territorial prison, still talking about guns split down the barrel and firing pins shot away at 50 paces. His voice carried neither pride nor embarrassment at his sudden fame. Just the same measured assessment. He applied to all aspects of his work. Can you blame them? Jacob Forrest commented from his usual chair by the window, where he kept watch more out of habit than necessity. 42 men neutralized without a single fatality. That's not something folks witness every day. The jailhouse door opened to admit Eleanor Reed, carrying her medical bag, though it had seen little use in recent days. A fact that gave her obvious satisfaction. Just checked on Carlos Sanchez. That hand injury from the rifle recoil is healing nicely. Should be back to blacksmithing by week's end. Her gaze lingered on Ethan for a moment longer than strictly necessary, something that hadn't escaped Jacob's observant eyes. The old marshal smiled to himself, recognizing the beginnings of a connection that extended beyond professional courtesy. "How's the schoolhouse coming along?" Ethan asked, setting aside his correspondence. "Madeline says they'll reopen on Monday. The children are actually excited to return. They've been playing sheriff and outlaws all week, though their version involves considerably more dramatic falling down than yours did." A tight smile touched Ethan's lips. I imagine their version makes for better storytelling. Speaking of stories, Miles interjected, you should hear what they're saying at Morgan's Tavern. Cooper's telling anyone who'll listen about how you shot a fly off Virgil Ward's hat brim without harming a hair on his head. I don't recall any flies involved, Ethan replied with a raised eyebrow. That's frontier legend for you, Forrest chuckled. Give it a month, and you'll have shot the buttons off Ward's coat while riding backward on a galloping horse. The light-hearted moment was interrupted by Samuel Wright, who entered with uncharacteristic haste. Riders coming in from the east, the storekeeper announced, slightly short of breath. 5 men, moving slow, don't look like trouble, but figured you'd want to know. Ethan rose from his desk with unhurried grace, checking his revolvers with the same methodical precision that had become his hallmark. Though Redemption Creek had known peace since Ward's capture, the young sheriff maintained his vigilance, a quality that had earned him the town's enduring respect. Outside, the midday sun illuminated a town, transformed not just physically, but spiritually. Shopkeepers who had once hurried to close at the first sign of trouble now conducted business with confidence. Children played openly in side streets where they had previously been forbidden to venture. Even Morgan's Tavern had undergone a transformation, its rowdier elements replaced by miners and travelers who understood that certain standards of behavior were now expected in Redemption Creek. The approaching riders came into view, their pace deliberately measured as they entered the main street. Unlike Ward's men, they carried no obvious armaments beyond the standard sidearms typical of frontier travelers. Their leader, a lean man with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, raised his hand in greeting as they approached the jailhouse. That's Robert Hollister, Forrest identified quietly, joining Ethan on the porch. Used to be sheriff over in Tucson before he took that railroad security position. Good man, solid reputation. Ethan nodded, watching as the riders dismounted. Before the jailhouse steps, Hollister approached alone, leaving his companions with the horses, a gesture that suggested this was a peaceable call rather than a confrontation. Sheriff Caldwell, Hollister called, removing his hat as a sign of respect. Robert Hollister, Chief of Security for the Western and Pacific Railroad, hoping we might have a word. Mr. Hollister, Ethan acknowledged with a slight nod. What brings railroad security to Redemption Creek? Hollister glanced around, noting the gathered onlookers with the practiced assessment of a man who had spent decades reading situations and potential threats. Might be better discussed in private, if you don't mind. Inside the jailhouse, introductions were made before Hollister revealed the purpose of his visit. Judge Harrison and the territorial marshal can't stop talking about what happened here. He began accepting the coffee Eleanor offered. Never seen either of them so impressed, and they're not men easily moved to admiration. We just did our job, Ethan replied simply. Hollister smiled. That's exactly what I told my employers. You'd say? He set down his cup, leaning forward with increased intensity. The Western and Pacific is expanding through some of the most lawless sections of the territory. 3 payroll shipments hit in the past month alone. 2 station agents killed. Sounds like a matter for the territorial authorities, Ethan observed. It should be, Hollister agreed. But they're stretched thin, and the railroad can't afford to wait for reinforcements that may never come. That's why I'm here. He reached into his coat, withdrawing an envelope sealed with the railroad's distinctive emblem. The Western and Pacific would like to create a specialized security division, men trained not just to guard shipments, but to protect communities along the expanding line. Men who understand that true security doesn't necessarily require bloodshed. He placed the envelope on the desk, sliding it toward Ethan. We'd like you to establish and lead this division, Sheriff. Caldwell. Full authority, substantial resources, and the opportunity to implement your methods on a much larger scale. A profound silence fell over the jailhouse as the implications of the offer became clear. Forrest's weathered face showed no surprise, as if he had been expecting something of this nature, while Miles looked caught between pride in his mentor's recognition and concern about what it might mean for Redemption Creek. "It's a generous offer," Ethan acknowledged, making no move to take the envelope. "But I have responsibilities here." "The railroad understands your commitment," Hollister countered smoothly. "That's why the position would allow you to maintain your role here while building something larger. Redemption Creek would become the training headquarters for the entire division, bringing prosperity, security, and prominence to the town." Outside the jailhouse, news of the railroad representative's arrival had spread quickly. Maria and Carlos Sanchez stood on their restaurant porch, watching with obvious interest. Samuel Wright had positioned himself near the general store, close enough to observe proceedings while maintaining a respectful distance. Most notable was the gathering outside Morgan's Tavern, where several of the town's more prominent citizens engaged in hushed speculation about the unexpected visitors. Inside, the discussion continued with increasing detail as Hollister outlined the railroad's proposal. The security division would initially comprise 20 men, all personally selected and trained by Ethan. They would operate along the expanding rail line, providing protection to communities that had previously been at the mercy of men like Virgil Ward. "It's not just about the money," Hollister emphasized, sensing Ethan's hesitation. "It's about creating something sustainable, a new approach to justice in territories where the law has always been outgunned and outmanned." "The same approach the sheriff used here," Forrest interjected, studying Ethan with knowing eyes. "The one that values precision over power, prevention over punishment." Eleanor, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "It would mean sharing what you've built here," she observed, "extending Redemption Creek's transformation to other communities that need it just as desperately." For the first time since Hollister's arrival, something shifted in Ethan's expression, a recognition of possibilities beyond the boundaries of the town he had sworn to protect. His extraordinary abilities had secured Redemption Creek's safety, but perhaps they could serve a larger purpose without abandoning the community that had placed its trust in him. "I'd need to discuss this with the town council," he said finally. "My first responsibility remains to Redemption Creek." "Of course," Hollister agreed, clearly pleased that his offer hadn't been immediately rejected. "The railroad understands the importance of community support. Take whatever time you need to consider." As the discussion concluded, Miles escorted Hollister back to his companions, leaving Ethan, Forrest, and Eleanor to process the unexpected proposal. "You knew something like this would happen," Ethan said to Forrest. "Not a question, but a recognition of the old Marshal's foresight. Gifts like yours don't stay hidden," Forrest replied simply. "Not when they're used as spectacularly as you use yours against Ward. Word spreads, opportunities follow. That's the way of things." "Is it what you want?" Eleanor asked, her direct question cutting through the practicalities to the heart of the matter. Ethan considered for a long moment, his methodical mind working through implications and possibilities with the same precision he applied to his marksmanship. "What I want," he finally replied, "is for what happened here to mean something beyond just one confrontation or one town. If there's a way to extend that meaning without abandoning what we've built, then yes, it's worth considering." The meeting with the town council took place that evening in the back room of Wright's General Store. The 7 elected representatives of Redemption Creek's civic interests gathered around the sturdy oak table that had hosted everything from business negotiations to wedding plans over the years. Thomas Fulton, the banker whose initial skepticism of Ethan had transformed into unwavering support, spoke first after the railroad's proposal was outlined. "It would bring considerable benefits to Redemption Creek," he acknowledged. not just financially, but in terms of prestige and security. A railroad headquarters means permanence in a way few frontier towns can claim. Madeline Parker, representing the town's educational interests, nodded in agreement. And it would allow Sheriff Caldwell to extend the protection he's provided us to other communities while maintaining his base here. There's a certain moral weight to that opportunity. The discussion continued, examining potential impacts on everything from commerce to community safety. Throughout, Ethan listened more than he spoke, considering each perspective with characteristic thoroughness. When all views had been expressed, he finally addressed the council directly. "This decision affects everyone in Redemption Creek," he said, his quiet voice commanding attention without demanding it. What happened with Ward wasn't just about one man with unusual abilities. It was about a community choosing to stand for something different, a kind of justice that doesn't require bloodshed to be effective. He paused, his gaze moving around the table. If we accept this opportunity, it will change Redemption Creek. New people, new responsibilities, new scrutiny. I won't make that decision alone. Fulton leaned forward, his usual financial pragmatism softened by genuine respect. What you did, what you showed us all was possible, that deserves to be shared beyond our boundaries. I say we embrace this chance to make Redemption Creek a symbol of something larger than itself. One by one, the council members voiced their agreement, recognizing an opportunity not just for prosperity, but for meaningful impact on the territory's future. As the meeting concluded, Ethan stepped outside to find the main street unusually active for the late hour. Word of the railroad's proposal had spread, drawing residents from their homes to gather in small groups, discussing what such a development might mean for their community. Eleanor approached from her clinic across the street, her expression questioning. "Well, what did they say?" "They support it," Ethan replied. "Unanimously, she studied him with the perceptiveness that made her such an effective physician. And you? Have you decided?" Before he could answer, a commotion near the edge of town drew their attention. A rider was approaching at speed, the pounding hooves echoing in the evening quiet. The man reined his horse to a sliding stop before the general store, his expression urgent as he dismounted. "Sheriff Caldwell," he called, spotting Ethan among the gathered townspeople. "Jefferson Hughes, dispatch rider for the Territorial Authority. Emergency message from Marshal Davies." He extended a sealed envelope bearing the marshal's official stamp. Ethan opened it, reading quickly as the gathered crowd waited in tense silence. "What is it?" Miles asked, having joined them from the jailhouse. "Prison break at the Territorial Facility," Ethan replied, his voice calm despite the gravity of the news. "Ward and 6 others escaped 3 days ago. They've already hit 2 settlements on the eastern route. The marshal believes they're heading this way." A ripple of alarm moved through the onlookers. The confrontation with Ward was still fresh in their memories, his reputation for vengeance well established. "He's coming back," Samuel Wright stated grimly. "For revenge. For justice, as he sees it," Ethan corrected, folding the dispatch with his usual precise movements. "But he'll find the same thing waiting for him that he found before." Instead of fear, a remarkable transformation moved through the gathered residents of Redemption Creek. Men who would have fled at the first sign of trouble just weeks earlier now stepped forward, offering their services. Women who would have gathered children and sought shelter instead began organizing supply preparations and communication networks. Hollister, who had been observing from the periphery, approached Ethan with newfound respect in his expression. "This is what the railroad wants to support," he said quietly. "Not just one exceptional lawman, but the community he's helped build. A place that stands its ground not through superior firepower, but through unity of purpose." As the town mobilized, with practiced efficiency, positions assigned, defenses prepared, contingencies established, Ethan watched with quiet pride. The confrontation with Ward had indeed changed Redemption Creek, transforming it from a collection of individuals into a true community united by shared values and mutual protection. "So," Eleanor said, returning to their interrupted conversation, "have you decided about the railroad's offer?" Ethan looked around at the town that had placed its trust in him, at the people who had discovered their own courage through his example, at the community that had redefined itself around principles of justice rather than fear. "I believe I have," he replied, checking his revolvers with those same precise movements that had become legend throughout the territory. "But first, we have unfinished business to attend to." As dawn approached, Redemption Creek prepared to face its challenge not as frightened individuals, but as a unified community. And at its center stood a young sheriff with extraordinary abilities, who had shown that true authority comes not from the power to take life, but from the wisdom to preserve it whenever possible. The legend that had begun with a lightning fast draw would continue, not just in Redemption Creek, but potentially throughout the territory. But first, Virgil Ward would learn once and for all that some lessons require more than one teaching, and that true justice, like lightning, can strike the same place twice. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.